Perfect. So we should be live. And let me just confirm that. Yeah, it is live. So I hope everybody can see and hear me. Hello, viewers. Welcome to Curiosity. Today's guests, we have three really great guests. May have a fourth show up, but we have Sean Yoshikawa, we have Risa, we have Rodney as well, and I'll invite them to do brief introductions for themselves. But let's why don't we hear a bit about what they do? So maybe we can start with Sean because he's sort of right there on my screen. Sean.
Yeah, most definitely. My name's Sean. I'm originally from San Francisco Bay Area and moved to San Diego in Southern California for college and kind of never left there. What my background is in health insurance. I ran a health insurance agency for about 7 years and sold it during COVID. But throughout the time when I was working in insurance, that's when I learned a lot about, I would say, the U.S. reimbursement system, CPT codes, and the payable amounts, and networked with a lot of the doctors, local clinics, and hospitals. And then after I sold my business, I transitioned to consulting companies, and specifically companies that are outside the US that want to come to the US and sell into the US market. So help them with kind of landscape analysis, understanding where their product fits, and where I can, I really want to help them put their products in the best light. So help them get in front of investors and in a way that's appealing to, I would say, the American business culture.
Thank you. And over to Risa, please.
Hi everyone, my name is Risa. I didn't realize everyone put their last names. My last name is Kazui. So I'm kind of like, oh, I don't have a last name, but my name is Risa Kazui. My full-time job is actually in healthcare consulting, which is kind of how Terrence and I kind of crossed paths in Singapore as well. But a lot of people, or most people, know me for my writings on LinkedIn. I originally started in Singapore, just exploring the startup venture space and talking to people, writing about my conversations. That kind of took off. I moved over here for my healthcare consulting job, and I was like, maybe I should try to do it again. So I started writing about Japan's venture landscape and startups, and that's been taking off. And now I have a podcast called Reese's Newsletter. And yeah, so I kind of say that I'm a writer of the startup landscape, but in full transparency, I'm still learning and exploring as well. I'm happy to be here, and thank you, Terrence, for organizing this.
Thanks a lot. And last but not least, over to Rodney.
Thank you, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you be. I realize my profile is going to sound very boring now after both of you, but so my name's Rodney Kelly. I'm currently the Japan ambassador for the Scottish Business Network. I'm helping lots of companies coming out of Scotland and the ecosystem there into Japan. But my background is essentially arrows both ways, helping European innovation into Japan and navigate the systems there with a specialization in healthcare. Mostly medtech is my real sweet spot. But increasingly, since I've returned to Japan since March, helping Japanese innovators communicate their value proposition and get out into the global markets. So it's been great to see the burgeoning and very exciting ecosystem here developing in Tokyo. And it's great to see the world starting to see the benefits of coming here to Japan. I think all of our inboxes are full in that regard. But yeah, it's great to see the relationship of Japan as well in the wider Asian context. And it's great to be on this podcast. So thank you, Terrence.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. I think if because I foolishly didn't introduce it clearly the topic for today is really trying to look into the Japan ecosystem. And because we all love a bit of an interactive session, so for viewers, please feel free to comment and ask questions in the chat, and I'll post them to a panel today. So without further ado, let's get stuck into the Japanese ecosystem, right? I mean, in terms of the ecosystem, because we hear drips and drabs, we do see a number of English sort of language reports, but most of it tends to be in Japanese naturally. So, you know, trying to shed some light on it, particularly in terms of the maturity and where do you think it's going? Perhaps I could sort of look at Sean, invite him to make some comments on that, and then I'm sure the others would join in.
Yeah, well, I'd say so. My perspective has been a lot of Japan going to the US, but myself going in Japan and having lived there and worked with companies there, I would say it is incredibly unique, especially from the startup point of view. I would say that they are very, from my experience, the Japanese are very accustomed to doing business with other Japanese and speaking to a Japanese buyer. You know, for the most part, the technology is decently sound. You know, I wouldn't say, you know, overall there's pretty much a lot of the budget goes into research and development. And I'd love to hear the other guests' thoughts on this, and also you, Terrence. But just the communication and expressing it, and especially when they're going outside of Japan, that's when it's basically it completely fizzles out. Especially Japan to US, that's something that's it's sometimes very painful to watch, to see them try to pitch either to investors or even to potential clients in sales. So I'm going to leave it at that. I can go into more detail, but I'm very fascinated, actually, everyone else's experience also.
Yeah, I'll definitely jump in on that, Sean, if I may. I think it's important to kind of zoom out and think where we are in the greater kind of macro geopolitical arena that Japan and innovation is at the moment. We're seeing naturally the fruits of a lot of innovation from clinical research organizations start to bear fruit. And we're starting to see, and this perhaps wasn't the case so much 10, 15 years ago, but we're starting to see a lot of particularly university spinouts think, right, let's do this, let's go global. And we're also starting to see a deeper understanding at kind of private sector level and government sector and governmental level that there is a need to get out. I think the world is changing very quickly, and Japan has in many ways perhaps been a victim of its own success in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And that innovation work, the people are suddenly kind of throwing coal into fire going, look, we really need to get this going. So we're seeing now the government saying, look, how can we get these innovations to globalize? So it's a different landscape than it was 5 years ago. We're seeing things like globalization funds, international marketing funds being made available. So in that regard, there is definitely a very positive change. But as Sean says, it's a very risk-averse culture, and Japan itself is such a good market, as it were. So often domestic success is enough, and your shareholders are happy with it. But as that domestic market shrinks, both by demographics and global competition, we're seeing people going, right, we need to get out. We need to make those partnerships overseas. America's the first place they tend to go. But it's a very expensive place to go. And you can fail fast and hard. And that's maybe not, there's not so much an acceptance of failure here as there is in the States, where it's kind of a badge of honor. I'll pick myself back up, go at it again. But yeah, we're starting to see a really broad range of kind of flowers popping up. And I'm sure actually that's what Risa, and I see her nodding, Risa will attest to, because yeah, I think you're very close with all those groups that are starting to percolate up and out of the innovation landscape.
Yeah, definitely. I think Sean gave a very good perspective from like Japan going into the US, and then Rodney gave like a really great like macro view of what's going on. I'm probably closer to like more of the grassroots movements of what's going on, because like I'm not really like technically trained in like the venture space, but I'm more interested in people's stories and their motivations. And what I can see for sure is like until now, becoming an entrepreneur or like a founder was very like radical. It was very different and unconventional, and slowly that's becoming cooler. People from like the top universities in Japan, the prestigious path is not to join a big bank or a consulting firm, but it's to become a founder. And that's really really exciting, because that means like high caliber top tier talent is going into this innovation space. But the caveat to this movement is that when you say becoming an entrepreneur or becoming a founder, what we picture these founders to aspire for in the Bay is very, very different, or like in the US is very different to Japan. Because whereas a lot of people overseas might believe, like, I want to be an innovator or a founder because I want this to enable this greater mission that I have in this universe, in this world, to fix an injustice. In Japan, oftentimes, unfortunately, it's to achieve an IPO. And then after you achieve the IPO and you get a nice exit, you'll get a nice place in Daikanyama, get a nice Mercedes Benz, and you kind of fall off the face of the earth and live a nice life. That's kind of what a lot of entrepreneurs had been doing in the past, but we're also seeing that shift slowly now, which is probably why Sean is seeing a lot more Japanese founders wanting to go overseas because they're aspiring for more, essentially. So a lot of shifts are happening, as Sean and Rodney mentioned, and I think in a very overall sense, I think it's a very exciting time to learn about Japan's ecosystem right now.
Great. I mean, I recall reading a report from METI that over 50% of top university students expect now to go and work at a startup. Would you say that that's the ground truth or close to it?
I would jump in on that. That would be a lovely figure, and I would. Again, not questioning the validity of the research, I think there may be an element of aspiration answering there. They would like to, but when it comes to the decision of, are you going to work for the the big company, or are you going to work for the startup? I think the risk aversion DNA of a lot of Japanese people would go, you know what, I'll just go for the big company for now. So there's work to be done on that for sure, in terms of encouraging the next generation and the current generation to take that leap of faith. I don't know
Yeah,
if
and
anyone else has.
yeah, I would add on to that, because like even what I see a lot in Japan is, although there might be like an increasing amount of startups and like entrepreneurs and founders, the types of startups is very different to what I see overseas. And like I don't know if this is like fortunately or unfortunately, but I noticed that there are a lot more like middleman businesses here, and agencies and advisories, and a lot less like things where you, I mean, I'm not a person to judge because I'm not a founder myself, but there's a lot less things where you're like, oh my god, this is like actually like so new and I've never seen anything like this, and most people would oppose to it because it's so revolutionary. So I think like the types of startups is a little bit different as well. Even if there is motivation and aspiration, the end product looks a bit different as well. Maybe Sean, you have some perspective to this.
I'm actually well, I'm actually very interested because both of you live in Tokyo, and when I'm there, I really proactively looked for, I'm going to say, like startup events, because in the US it's everywhere is a startup event and everyone's an entrepreneur in their free time, right? So it's like maybe it's just something I was like, oh, of course there's going to be a bunch of events. And but when I was really searching, there's a couple. One was what is it, CIC, like Cambridge Institute.
Yeah.
They have their coffee thing on Thursdays, but it seemed like it was like 75% foreigners, a little bit of Japanese, but it wasn't so much like a homegrown, hey, this is our Japanese innovation, entrepreneur ecosystem. It seemed like it was kind of pushed by foreigners, and then there's some Japanese people that were interested. So I'm curious if like is that just maybe a foreign thing? Is it an American thing? Because you can just go on Eventbrite or any of these meetups, and there you can, you can walk the next block, and there's going to be another entrepreneur startup something session. So I'm curious what you guys have seen.
I think that's oh, is my audio gone strangely?
Oh no, we have Theo's joined in with a lot of echo.
Yeah. Oh, turn off my mic.
Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. That was it. I could hear myself there. No, I was thinking that's a really good point, Sean, and I noticed that when I first came back. And actually, I mean, I can't share my screen, but there is a really interesting report that came out, or I think it's coming out around now, and it's called the GSER report, which is the Global Startup Ecosystem Report from an organization called Startup Genome. I highly recommend you check them out. And what it does, I mean, their role is to globally look at ecosystems around the world and see who is, as it were, doing well and why they're doing well. And the top spot is still held by the Bay Area, and number 2 is joint London and New York. And there are those rising rapidly up, some really interesting ones in Eastern Europe and so on, some kind of city-states that are really, or cities, sorry, that are really, and Singapore, Terence, is doing very well. I think it's now in 7th or 8th, and it was 15th before. But it's interesting to see where Tokyo is. And Tokyo's 15th. Now, that's not me in any way shaming Tokyo, but when you look at the metrics breakdown of what makes it 15th, and if you live here, you think, wow, why is it 15th? There's so many big businesses here. They have a wonderful kind of spider chart, and one of the things that is its lowest metric is global reach and global outreach and the globalization of the workforce. Now, that's in sharp contrast to if you look at the big traditional zaibatsu companies that Japan has. They have tentacles all over the world. So there is that disconnect about what's happening here on the ground that Sean noticed. You go, and there are, Sean, you're absolutely right, a lot of foreigners. That's something I know that the Tokyo metropolitan government, places like Fukuoka, Kobe, Tohoku area as well, they're trying to like really throw their hat in the ring and go like, let's really make this place a global startup ecosystem. But it's tough, and it requires multimodal approach from all aspects, and I think that's a bit slower than it ought to be honest.
Right. Thanks, Rodney. I think on that note, we've got Theo who joined us. Very thankful to all our guests today, in particular Sean and Theo, because it is quite early for them. It's sort of 7 in the morning for them. For Reese and Rodney, it's obviously 11 p.m. It's probably the best sort of in-between timing we can find, not crazy early and not crazy late. So perhaps on that note, we'll just invite Theo to give sort of a brief introduction of himself.
Yeah, sure. Sorry. Yeah, sorry for being late. Yeah, so from my background, it's been on a global front, was kind of traveling around, I think from 2022 to 2024. Was in Singapore from 2018 to 2021, and then really got involved into the venture ecosystem from 2021 on. 2022 to 2024 was really traveling and then really understanding, both from like the Forbes under 30 kind of hub perspective. So really reaching out, kind of getting a feel for starting with Korea and then with Japan after. And it's one of the interesting notes that I think Rodney is bringing up, this kind of the SER report, because I'm seeing Seoul at number 9 and Japan at Tokyo at number 10. I think 2023 rankings is what he's going off of for 15. But Seoul has been kind of rising up. Tokyo's kind of had this kind of up and down. So I'm curious too, because one of the things I did notice from Seoul was really one of these these kind of like hybrid, similar in makeup to like Japan, but I'm seeing like A16Z had chosen really Tokyo and Japan really to be their first hub in Asia compared to Singapore and to Seoul. So I'm kind of curious what was kind of the take from the group on why particularly Japan. Is it maybe the population? Is it maybe that it did have a high point at some point compared to that of Korea? And I think Riza would also know this too, right? Like the cultural differences, yes, there are some, but really the same challenges exist in both hubs. So I'm curious what kind of the group take is on that.
Would anybody like to take that on?
I'm happy to. If I understand really what your point is, Theo, I think focusing on what the good points are, right? What the kind of why Japan. Firstly, as I said before, it is a huge market, and I think a lot of people know, and this is particularly true of the badge one gets from having been through the clinical validation process here, which it's a long journey. But I think if you do go into other surrounding markets, in fact, globally, but particularly in Asia, and you say, I have my regulatory approval in Japan, that's a level of due diligence that gives assurance to any foreign investors that you've really, I'm trying to think of a non-colorful word, but know your stuff. There's also a sustainability aspect here. If you do get into the Japanese market and you show commitment to the Japanese market, whether that's in the form of, setting up an actual company and actually putting people on the ground, or a deep partnership, the relationships that you have with your Japanese clients, if you don't do anything very poor, you're likely to have a relationship and a customer for a very long time. And that's not the case in many markets where you can be dropped. So there is that loyalty to between client and customer that I think makes it a very attractive market. And there also is, particularly in clinical research, if you're looking to do further research, there's wonderful clinical institutions here that are clearly world class. And again, that gravitas that comes from doing the research here can be amplified in your global marketing. But again, there are lots of other challenges, but I'll pass it back to Terence, who can help us navigate through that.
Yeah, well, I suppose, just pulling on the string of the opportunities, right? I think Reese is fairly close to the ground on this, and Sean probably has experienced this. I mean, from your points of view, what are the opportunities? So if we're looking at the opportunities sort of from an innovator's perspective, if I'm from outside Japan and I'm thinking of starting Notion again and going into Japan to build it, I mean, what are the opportunities? Because I see all the Meta reports around tax breaks and things like that, but what's the ground truth, I guess? Yeah, maybe Risa can hop in.
I don't know on like a high level, or like on a law perspective, or like a policy perspective, but I have heard from many people that Japan's kind of a place where there's a lot of raw material that doesn't know how to be repackaged in a way that can be properly commercialized and turned into a product. Whereas I've also heard an AI expert, like a AI founder, serial entrepreneur who's tried to build in Singapore and now is in Japan. He said Japan has way more potential and way more like really raw talent, like good talent. So I can't say for sure. This is all based on like testimonies and anecdotes, but I would assume that Japan, maybe there's a lot more to work with compared to other places. And it's a matter of having these like business savvy people come in, repackage it, and make it in a way that's appealing to the global market. And maybe that's why they're coming in. That's just my theory, though.
Excellent. And I suppose from the ventures side, right? Have we seen a lot of interest from the ventures side?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Theo or Sean may have something in this.
I'll say it real quick. It's interesting that Risa brought that up because I think that's kind of what I'm doing is I'm going to Japan to repackage but instead of like a physical good, it's kind of their story and their pitch and their product to make.
Oh, I think we lost.
That much experience.
Oh.
Sorry?
Oh, sorry, Sean.
We lost you for a second.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I don't know that I have that much experience there selling into it because I guess my service is to bring them out. But I, in another way, to Risa's point, I think there is a lot of very interesting raw material talent, but needs to be repackaged in a way, at least from my point of view, to go internationally.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, I'm echoing on myself. Okay.
Sorry, I too, because I think specifically from like biotech and from even from health tech, I think that's one of the fields that we can at least see within like the last 10 to 15 years from Japan, right? So if you look at digital therapeutics, really, especially even during the COVID, really COVID boom era of digital therapeutics, you'll see it with a lot of the partnerships, right? Like I think it was like Otsuka or some of these big Japanese conglomerates are really going into partnerships, trying to capitalize on the wave that really I hadn't seen any of the APAC nations or even Southeast Asian, right? That you would think maybe Singapore would have kind of gotten in on. I think with the PDMA compared to like the KFDA, you would think with maybe similarities in how they approach it. I think Singapore's regulatory systems is a little more mirroring that of like the EU. One particular example that I'm even seeing, particularly in biotech, one of my old professors I used to work with, Prof. DiCarlo, he just locked in a partnership for one of his startups with Sony. And I'm just saying, like Sony is randomly going into biotech that I hadn't really seen. That'd be the closest is like maybe Samsung, right? Like, that I know of. And Samsung actually does have a digital health division in the US. So you would think maybe with all the similarities and especially with like kind of the established channels, you would see more of these, especially from given like, I think my perspective on this is compared to the other APAC nations, what makes Japan within the region much more desirable, right? In terms of more of these future initiatives, compared to that of Singapore, where you would think, hey, with all these established things, is it the lack of maybe the drugs that have been approved via the FDA? Japan at least had some drug on the market from the 1980s, right? From on. So really with the rise of the FDA, and you've kind of seen it with all the new regulatory, so maybe there is kind of this digital aspect that is playing a role, especially given last year's FDA overhaul of the AIML, so much more on the tech bio stack. And that's something that we've really seen. Maybe it's, as Rodney was saying, the more established Japanese companies are being more experimental with like SoftBank maybe backing, or some of these bigger conglomerates really just doing it. The closest I've seen maybe in APAC was like Vingroup with VinBrain, especially, right? Like, so we're seeing it, but I haven't really seen anything, from Korea or from Singapore, right? That I've seen that makes it such a flagship in these kind of new, whether it's regulations or regulated environments that make me go, okay, this makes it interesting because they're tackling it head on. Yeah.
Yeah, Theo, I think that's an absolutely terrific point you made about Sony, for example. It's a great example. I mean, if you're looking at the Japanese market, right, and you're an innovator and you're pre-Series A, or you're around that area, and you get a partner like that. And I actually have seen it happen only last week. I was at NTT Data Healthcare Co-Creation Lab. Now, NTT, if you know NTT, are and for those who are watching around the world, they're the telecoms giant. But they have bit by bit been building their capability in innovation, and now they've got this terrific healthcare lab where they're bringing in innovations from all around the world, and using their tentacles, and their very large tentacles, to get them out. And what's even more interesting is the big business, let's call it, to big business collaborations that are happening at that level. So if you get your medtech innovation into that lab and I was asking them who comes here to look at this. They gave me a list of some of the biggest companies, including life insurance, the big companies like Sony. Come and have a look. So you're going to get exposure to, I mean, from a BD point of view, it's a dream, because you're getting some big fish coming to look at your innovation, and that's within the context of a big fish. So the muscle, I think, of these conglomerates should not be underestimated, and that does make the juice worth the squeeze.
Yeah,
Sorry, I echoed.
No, it's okay. I think my audio is bringing the echo, but actually, you're bringing up a really good point about the muscle. Because even with these more established like accelerators, like plug and play, especially when you're seeing these kind of cross-border landing pads towards the US, the sheer amount of capital that they're bringing in, even compared to like Korea, right? So like I would imagine, you would think they would be fighting essentially with like, per startup, how much are they spending? It's about 10x from what I've seen from initial offers. And Jetro is doing a huge push, similar to what like Enterprise Singapore had done with a lot of their startups when they were bringing them over. Right now, there's much more established plays. I think in terms of, particularly within biotech, you see them with like Cedars-Sinai Accelerator. But with Japan, I haven't really seen that yet. But from a general startup push between the government, I think between established IPO kind of pathways from SoftBank, and then even those giant conglomerates really just kind of pushing in now, not just I would say the bigger pharmaceuticals that we've kind of seen in the established player space compared to like that of Korea, and Singapore. Yeah, it's really fascinating just how much they're just pushing in. And I'm just curious, in the last few years, what's been kind of causing that inflection point. So even from a general tech, right, we're seeing like A16Z come in. And then from a biotech, tech bio, kind of digital health, and even medtech standpoint, you can almost say, hey, there does seem to be a little more experience from Japan in these more established partnerships towards an FDA approval route, but yeah, it's fascinating. So it's almost as if the front runners and these kind of much more experimental, and like, we won't mention WeWork as much with SoftBank, right? But they do have experience kind of propping in and going hard and heavy on just massive, like almost risky bets if you want to really think about it from a cross-border perspective. But it's just fascinating to see.
I find all of this very interesting because I hadn't heard of like more of like the big boys and what they're doing, but I talked to like researchers and students from like Tokyo U and doing their masters and doing research, and one of the biggest problems that they face in like the crossover between like doing research and then becoming like an innovator or a founder is that like commercializing your research is still very frowned upon in their academic society. And I was wondering if this is something that you see in other markets too. And if so, what were some solutions or what are some ways that they overcame that hurdle? Because I mean, one of them is like there's this taboo to commercialize their research. And the other hurdle is these students themselves don't have the business acumen or the education or the desire or the information of the possibility of commercializing. So like I get that these big boys moving around and moving money around and creating funds and, you know, budgets to do this is good, but if we don't have the people themselves who actually do the grunt work to produce the research and want to commercialize, then I think it's a bigger issue. So I wanted to hear, like, if you've seen this like problem before and how they like deal with it.
Yeah, Lisa, I have to comment on that. It's icky to commercialize and flaunt your academic prowess into commercial revenue it's cavernous, that gap here. I was up at Tsukuba Daigaku, just some of the brightest minds. And obviously they know I'm the guy who comes to do that. I'm the business guy who comes with graphs and maps and so on. And there is a kind of almost, I can feel the antibodies rising when I get there.
They like run away. They're like, no.
They're like, oh no, the business guy. But and I like that about them, and that's what makes them so good. And we need people to be able to keep looking down that microscope and keep discovering. But there needs to be that bridging energy and force, and that's definitely a gap you identified in Japan. From my time in Singapore, on the contrary, I saw people that were very entrepreneurial in spirit, almost to the detriment of like, you haven't finished your research yet, right? You know, okay, and they're already, you know, looking at setting up a business. In the UK, it was somewhere in the middle. So it really is market by market. How we overcome that, Risa, is people like you, and you bringing together the business people and getting them all around the table and saying, look, this is, you know, you can paint a bit of a picture. You don't have to say, you know, you can have that Mercedes and Daikanyama, but here's the lives you can be contributing to if this is commercialized. So yeah, it's a really good point. And it's a very cultural and socially relevant point.
Yeah. And I also heard like their stipends for research is so little. Like I don't know how they live. So by such a small scale. So they don't have the capacity to think about commercializing as well when they're working another job as well. Or sometimes their universities don't even allow them to do another job. So I don't know. There are a lot of like systematic like barriers as well, is what I thought.
Well, I did want to chime in too, because I just spoke with the NSF Corps yesterday for the hub at UCLA. So I think also from a government standpoint, but on even your point about the stipend, that actually makes it so that I think the average founder in San Francisco for a founder that's funded is like almost 130K a year, which is, that's a full salary, right? So like so now we, you know, kind of puts into context, if it's AI, if it's not AI, get out of here, right? Because then there's no justification to go up to that. I was seeing a LinkedIn post from someone saying, oh yeah, I'm on 40K. And I'm like, wait, that's what I made after my academic career, right? Like that's what I made after my master's in the States, right? So, and then Singapore, when I was there and helping Prof. Dean Ho at the, you know, National University of Singapore and the spinoff for Kind Therapeutics, right? So I kind of saw all these different ecosystems at play, but I would almost say that the low stipend, I think some of the startups that are coming are probably also, right, Japanese PhDs who may be going back and kind of bringing this entrepreneurial spirit, you know, that we're seeing in the US. Because now it's, okay, you get a PhD, would you want an 80 to 90K starting salary, right? At a big pharma, if that, if you're lucky enough to negotiate to that, maybe you get into 6 figures. Or if you're going to go back, maybe you start something else, right? So there really is kind of, you're almost seeing a rise of these academic labs who are getting into the process of pumping it out, right? Whether you see organizations like Nucleate, or it's like student-run organizations, or you see NSF Corps. So really, there might be something. I think academic is probably the place, because you have to start with someone's IP, right? Especially in biotech, right? Like the most valuable asset is the intellectual patent, right? So I know there was another folk here like Wilson Sonsini, and they're partnering with the local law firms, right, in Japan. and then they're really going, hey, I know the Japan lead, Kenji Funahashi. He's like, we just partner with them, right? Usually you would set up a satellite office and you would bring them over. But in this case, there really is it's almost a perfect storm that I'm only really seeing in maybe biotech, or one, really, like the bigger conglomerates are there. I think the academic is, you already are starting with a very low paid, workforce population that you really don't have to worry about in terms of, hey, the sheer capital. And then I think from all the years of abuse in academia, then we're almost getting ready for the startup life, right? Because you have this uncertainty mindset where you don't know. I don't even know my hypothesis. I don't know my research. I'm going in with a blind question, and then hopefully it turns into a patent. So it almost might be conducive for this kind of both the population. If you really want to be entrepreneurial, you already went through the pressure hatch. And then you already know there's only so many established players that you can either exit out to, go for an M&A, and then go for the cross-border play, or you already right, there's only so many, even within the academics, you're only seeing 5 to 10 KOLs, right? Key opinion leaders that you could really reach out to and collaborate. And you're very mindful of the competition. So I would say of all the fields, this is probably the one that you could probably do it from a cultural perspective and just a mentality, because you have to go for an innovative approach no matter how. And then if you have it, you need the blessing of your professors. So you already have essentially an advisor built onto a team. And then that brings in also the track record for funding too.
Cool. Thank you for your perspectives. It's been great. There've been a few questions. I know we ran over. I know before we started, I said we'd stop at 1:30 because Sean had to drop off. There were a couple comments. Perhaps what I'll do is I'll shoot in the question. So, we're hearing about the aspirational goals of uni graduates, right? Is that, the presumption is to be a founder, although I suspect maybe it's not. So correct me on that first point. And then the second point is, do they have the right capabilities and experience to actually, as a founder, start a sustainable business or to contribute to a sustainable business? I think Reese has probably considered this one a little bit just before Rodney chimes in, because I know Rodney sees quite a lot as well.
So the question is, are they trying to be founders, or are they aspiring for something
So
else?
I'm sorry, it's a smash question, two-part question. Are they trying to be founders, or are they joining a startup, right? Or are they working for a startup? And whatever the question is, do they have the right capabilities and experience?
Okay, I think I said founder earlier, but that's correct. I think it's to join a startup is becoming more popular among overall university college grads. But I think the Tokyo University data point was more about becoming an entrepreneur rather than joining a startup. So I think there are like different data sets there. I don't have it on hand right now, so I can like check it later.
Sure.
The second question is, do they have the capabilities to actually build or be part of or contribute to a sustainable startup? Bro, I don't know. I think it depends on the person. But I will say for sure that the majority of founders in Japan do tend to be more humanities oriented people. Whether or not that creates a sustainable startup is another discussion, but it does definitely affect the type of startups that come out of Japan. Some people see it as a problem because of this whole thing about becoming a technical founder. But yeah, that's a discussion for another day. But Rodney, you might have some thoughts about this.
Absolutely. My first thought is, if you are to speak to 100 founders of successful companies, ask them about their journey, they'll tell you they didn't have a clue what they were doing in the beginning. And therefore, I firmly believe that everyone can learn on the job. And everyone does learn in the job is a wider metaphor for life, really. But I think it's the structures around them. And by structures, I mean, obviously government support, but also kind of societal structure. We talked about failure earlier, and if one can be accepted if you have failed. I think there's a lot of responsibility around society to say, you know what, if you are going to be a work in a startup, then go for it, and don't worry about your mistakes. And how can that be? I mean, that's nice to say, but how can that be legislated for? That's what the government really needs to look at, as they're starting to see the traditional model of export heavy Japan starting to be undermined and slip down the global GDP rankings. They have to do something about that. Let's not call it a stigma, but essentially it is a stigma to saying, I can do this alone and I can do this, because without that, you're never really going to have a firing on all cylinders innovation ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we're coming up to time, so super quickly, I'm just going to go around and ask one slightly existential question to get your hot take on it, right? So what do you think Japan is to the world, right? So I remember seeing a little bit of discussion on this on LinkedIn. I can't remember where it came from, maybe from Risa, it could be. So maybe we can start with Risa. So what's your hot take on what's Japan to the world in terms of sort of startup ecosystem and entrepreneurship?
I can't speak for policy or the macro level, but in terms of people and individuals, I have a feeling that Japan is a place to start over, and Japan is a clean slate for a lot of people. So a lot of people who want to go on a sabbatical, figure out themselves, try a new thing, they come to Japan and they kind of try it out. So I think that's kind of what Japan is to a lot of people overseas.
So a safe space.
Yeah, or like a new place. A very like the rules are different, the paradigm is different. There are new people. Yeah, you can do anything you want in a way and not get judged in a way as well. Yeah.
Cool. And Rodney. Yeah, hot take.
Yeah, that's a hot take. I would say the first thing is Japan is a kind of validatory stepping stone into the rest of the world. Come here, go through the challenge of setting up, getting regulatory approval. The rest of the world will listen to you, as well as, in brackets, you get access to a great market. But it's also it's the wise grandfather in the corner who you would go to and say, Granddad, I need a bit of help from this, and I can help you. We're in business together. Let's innovate together. But can I borrow some money to do so? Because there are funding structures, and let's say the granddad had a very good commercial career. So it's a stepping stone and a very wise granddad.
Awesome. And over to Theo.
I think it's hitting both of kind of what Risa and Rodney was saying, but I would say from the US, there is something interesting because Japan really had an impact from the 80s on, right? So from the stock bubble, even from a cultural standpoint, you'll still see, and it's fascinating to talk to like Black Americans about this, right? Like the impact of like anime, and like if you're on Black Twitter and you're on Black YouTube, you'll see it, right? Like a lot of people referencing anime. I think Korea is catching up on that cultural front, right? Where now there's a difference between like manga and manhwa. But Japan also, because of the 80s, you'll see they had essentially all the right infrastructure and the build up from there, right? From both manufacturing perspective, essentially on a global scale that we hadn't really seen from any of the other APAC nations, right? Like, and you'll see it from the other ones as they're also catching up on the manufacturing, the partnerships and whichever. But it's fascinating. So it's almost like, and then now kind of with the rise of the military, right? In terms of also being able to combat really the elephant in the room or lack thereof, right? Which was China, right? So like in terms of both kind of the geopolitical, being in the strategic place, having the right kind of cultural kind of kind of cultural impact that lasted, and then people are still familiar, right, in terms of what is Oriental and what it is from the West, right? The snapshot that kind of impacted us for the last maybe 40, 50 years. So I think there is something about like a nostalgia, but also a familiarity. And then it's almost as if what is going to be kind of the auto manufacturing equivalent, right? What is going to be the electronics manufacturing equivalent? After NVIDIA and the Jensen Huang era of the microchips, right, which was shifting over towards China and Taiwan, what is going to be the next big thing? And I think that really might be the biotech question, right? That might be the pharmaceutical question. So I think that's where it's really interesting, is it's almost, where's the red sun again, right? And when will it rise again? I think there is kind of an impact point right now. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So on that note, thank you very much for everybody for joining me. Thank you for my guests. Thank you for watching. It means a lot. Please, to the viewers, please take a moment to like, sub, and please stay curious. Take care. Bye-bye.